Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, The State of Cannabis in the States, a Federal Overview. My name is Gail Mercier, and I am a real estate partner in our St. Louis office and the co-chair of our cannabis practice. Before we begin, we wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer these during the webcast, but if a more complete answer is needed, or if we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the resource widget. We encourage you to download any resources or links that you may find useful. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is CLE accredited for 1.2 hours of general CLE credit in Missouri and 1 hour general CLE credit in California and in Illinois. We award CLE based upon attendance for the entire 60 minutes. From time to time, you will be required to click a pop screen to reflect your continued engagement. We value your opinions and appreciate your participation in the course. Our presenters today are Jack Jacobson, Kevin Young, and T.O. Otudayo. I'm now going to turn this over to Jack to get us started.
Jack, are you on?
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Gail. As Gail said, I'm Jack Jacobson, and I'm advisor in our lobbying and policy group in Washington. That means I'm very active on Capitol Hill, working on bills related to cannabis. Next slide, please. There's a lot of activity and energy in Congress right now around these issues. This is the busiest Congress since Prohibition with regard to cannabis legislation. There have already been 7 congressional hearings on everything from veterans affairs to banking to criminal justice reform related to cannabis specifically. We've got 61 bills that are pending, and those cover the jurisdiction of 17 congressional committees. It's a lot of work. A lot of chairmen and chairwomen are busy and engaged in this issue. It's a lot of Hill staff that are working on these issues. There's an immense pressure to resolve the banking issue. This is an $11 billion a year industry, and it's growing by leaps and bounds. About 30% of that $11 billion is cash sales, which is really difficult to handle. Once the conflict between state law and federal law on access to financial services is resolved, we expect another major round of investment and activity. But banking needs to be addressed, and I'll dig into that in a bit. In the meantime, justice advocates are clamoring for things like decriminalization and record expungement for criminal convictions related to cannabis. Very busy right now. Next slide. This slide gives you an overview of the main issues where legislation has been introduced this Congress. I'll get into specifics shortly, but you can see that the issues related to marijuana go far beyond banking and legalization. Next. The 2018 Farm Bill descheduled industrial hemp, which Congress thought would open up the market, but obviously there are still some kinks to work out. Hemp is a cousin of marijuana, containing CBD and low levels of THC, which is the psychoactive compound in marijuana. Visually, hemp and marijuana are virtually indistinguishable, which matters later in this conversation. Hemp is defined as having a dry weight of less than 0.3% THC. The THC testing methods we have are imperfect, and results can fluctuate significantly. That's one reason that research is a priority for this Congress. Both law enforcement and financial institutions are taking a very conservative view of industrial hemp. This means they would rather err on the side of caution and assume a product is marijuana and not industrial hemp. This has led to arrests of individuals transporting hemp across state lines and resulted in financial institutions refusing to serve hemp or CBD clients. You're seeing a little bit of movement by federal agencies on industrial hemp, but not nearly enough to open up the market. Last week, the National Credit Union Administration issued interim guidance confirming that federally insured credit unions may provide financial services to legitimate hemp businesses. And on interstate commerce, this summer we've seen at least 2 truck drivers arrested and charged in Idaho and South Dakota for transporting industrial hemp across state lines. Law enforcement believed that hemp was, in fact, marijuana. Senator McConnell has a large constituency of industrial hemp farmers in Kentucky, and he wants Kentucky to be able to cash in on this industry. There have been 15 bills introduced to support hemp and CBD from hemp industries and clarifying federal laws and regulations. Next. Criminal justice. This is a new front that's really starting to gain momentum now that we've got a Democratic House. Criminal justice reform has become a priority for liberal Democrats. They believe that legislation that corrects the wrongs of the war on drugs inflicted by minority communities should pass before any other bills receive attention. They're looking at things like expungement of records, decriminalization of marijuana, and setting aside of convictions related to marijuana. You've probably noticed that marijuana justice reform has been embraced by the Democratic presidential candidate. One of the main criminal justice bills was introduced last month by the chair of the House Judiciary Committee and Senator Kamala Harris, who's running for president. It's a minority. The MORE Act includes descheduling, and it includes legalizing marijuana, and it expunges marijuana-related convictions in federal courts. It's a priority for civil rights and justice advocates. Unfortunately, this is more of a messaging bill than actual law that's going to get passed. As written, the legislation has some glaring constitutional issues, and of the co-sponsors in the House and Senate combined, there's a single House co-sponsor who is Republican. This bill is also deficient as it has no federal regulatory regime for marijuana and related products and derivatives. This means that there's no setup in the bill once cannabis is legal for FDA to have a path forward. Without a regulatory regime, we're going to continue to have the problems that we're seeing right now as to how cannabis and CBD are regulated by the federal government. There are a few other bills related to criminal justice that have been introduced, but the MORE Act is really where the action is. Next.
Yeah, Jack, let me just jump in here.
Please.
And just sort of highlight the fact that, the states are also looking at social equity. And we'll touch upon this later, but most particularly Illinois' new bill that legalize recreational use had a significant component to advance social equity, and the thought is other states may look to adopt that sort of approach as well.
Yeah, and the talk in Washington is that the Illinois model is very strong. It's good for use in other states, and there are components of it that the U.S. Congress is looking to adopt as well. It's a terrific template, and a lot of the marijuana advocates on a national level are really looking to Illinois as the roadmap for how to get a bill to the regular legislative process and what components should be in a bill in addition to legalization. Veterans access. So I'm part of a veteran family, so this is a really important issue to me, but I'm going to go through these next couple of slides a little bit faster. They're important issues, but they're not incredibly sexy or controversial. On veterans access, Congress and the VA have started making some headway, and veterans organizations are fairly united on prioritizing veterans access to cannabis and cannabinoids. There are about 11 bills that are pending. There are different bills that would allow VA doctors to recommend marijuana to treat various conditions like PTSD. I don't believe any of the bills would allow a VA doctor to prescribe marijuana, since it is a controlled substance and it's still illegal at the federal level. No doctors can technically prescribe marijuana. They can recommend marijuana, though, and this would just extend that to allow VA doctors to recommend to their patients that cannabis might be an alternative to traditional treatments. There is another bill that would require the VA to conduct cannabis research. That bill, the VA Medical Cannabis Research Act, has received a hearing in the House, and it's got, I believe, 75 co-sponsors, so it's got a lot of traction, and that's a bipartisan bill. These bills are really hoping to address veteran suicidality and opioid and prescription drug overdoses, both accidental and deliberate. On patient care, there is a lot of activity here, and patient advocates are really looking to protect state medical marijuana programs. These programs are very popular. Folks are using this for everything from chronic pain to, as I said, PTSD, to treatment with cancer and other things. So they're very, very popular, and continues to be some level of nervousness that the federal government could do things to screw up those programs. The CARES Act would provide a safe harbor for state medical marijuana programs, and the bill would reduce barriers to research. One of the things that the CARES Act also does, it doesn't deschedule marijuana, but it reschedules it to Schedule 2, meaning there is an accepted medical use for the drug. Other drugs that are on Schedule 2 include things like opium, cocaine, and fentanyl. And I have a question here. Are current bills and views at the federal level leaning toward medical legalization or adult legalization? On a federal level, neither of those are really being talked about seriously. There are components on the medical, like the patient care bill, the VA care bills, that would start to move the federal government and regulatory agencies to embrace the medical benefits, or at least research those medical benefits of marijuana. And in terms of full adult legalization, I think we're 5 to 7 years out from that. It's a really heavy lift, and there isn't the political will to do that right now. I think Canada legalizing puts more pressure on the U.S. government to take actions in that direction. I think Mexico will legalize shortly, and we like to do what our neighbors do. So there is a lot of hope in the advocacy community that full legalization will occur, but it's still a little way off.
And Jack,
on research,
Jack, what would the States Act, what would the implication of the States Act if it were to pass, or maybe you might comment on its status in terms of legalization?
Sure. The States Act is a bill that was primarily introduced to deal with banking issues. What it would do would say that if a transaction or the state has a legal program with legitimate businesses, that certainly those financial transactions would be legal in the eyes of the federal government. That could also lead to more research, more availability for medical marijuana, things of that nature as well. The States Act, unfortunately, looks like it stalled a bit. At the beginning of the session of Congress, States Act looked like it was going to be the bill that people were betting on, because it would, in fact, say that transactions that are legal in a jurisdiction, whether it be medical or personal use, would be legal in the eyes of the federal government. Unfortunately, what that would do is open up the Controlled Substances Act. When you've got a Controlled Substances Act, which can be fairly controversial, and you open that up, you're not opening up just the piece around marijuana, you're opening up the full act, and anything related to that act becomes germane in Congress, and folks start to pile on a lot of additional bells and whistles that tend to tank a bill. So the States Act has fallen out of favor over the last 4 or 5 months, And in terms of banking, the SAFE Banking Act is really where folks are putting their energy, working on amendments, refining the language, and that's where the movement is. And I'll get to that in a few minutes here. And that's on patient care. On research. Research is a big topic where policymakers generally agree that there needs to be much more leadership, engagement, and funding by the federal government. These bills, and there are quite a few of them, 15 at least, would allow or require federal agency research activities on cannabinoids and derivatives. Federal agencies that would conduct this research would include the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Veterans Affairs. But on a bigger note, a lot of our basic scientific research is conducted by institutes of higher education, and these research bills would allow those institutes of higher education to use federal funds for research purposes. Most universities receiving federal funding have not engaged in marijuana research because they don't want to put other federal funds at risk that they receive.
Jack,
got another question that I'm going to get to. Yes.
Before you could turn there, could you describe the DEA announcement yesterday and what that means for possible research?
Sure. Well, yesterday, this was a big development in D.C. I was working with some folks on some supporting briefs for some federal judicial action against the Drug Enforcement Agency because they've held up approvals of research applications. But yesterday, the Drug Enforcement Administration announced that it's going to be moving forward to facilitate and expand medical research for marijuana in the U.S. Provided notice for the pending applications for entities that have applied to be registered manufacturers of marijuana for researchers. So this is a big deal. Right now, the federal government, the biggest place that folks go for medical marijuana research is the University of Mississippi, and they're way behind on fulfilling requests for marijuana for research, and they've got fairly low quality products that they're shipping around the country. So the DEA has control over those applications and is starting to move in the direction of granting more licenses to grow marijuana for research. Unfortunately, they're not just going to approve the applications that have been submitted to date. Instead, they're going to propose new regulations that will govern the marijuana growers program for scientific and medical research. That means that there's going to have to be a full regulatory process before they start issuing new licenses. So it's a step forward, but it's a step back as well, meaning a regulatory process through the DEA is going to take months, if not years. So it's a good indication that this administration and the federal government are moving in the right direction, but they're moving very, very slowly. We've got a question: seeing controversy involving people legally using marijuana under state laws and conflicts with federal firearms laws prohibiting possession or purchase of firearms by someone using marijuana. I think this goes to the social justice components to some degree. When you've got state programs that allow it, but there is this conflict with firearms laws, that has not been a big issue that I've seen on the legislative front, but certainly there are going to be a lot of folks, particularly on the conservative side, that are going to want to weigh in on this as legislation continues to move forward. And beyond research, we've got a new frontier in insurance. This is a big issue, and it's related to banking, but it's an issue where the federal, actually the national trade associations in the insurance industry haven't been out front on this issue, and now there is a consensus within the industry, and folks are really starting to pay attention to the importance of the insurance component related to cannabis. The insurance industry at large is coming together to advocate changes in federal laws pertaining to insurance coverage, and the industry is seeking federal protection for serving cannabis and ancillary businesses. So we all know that insurance is foremost regulated at the state level, but extending federal protections to the degree that they matter are really important for a lot of our insurance carriers. And now we're not just talking about property and casualty insurance here. There are a wide range of issues covered. First and foremost, workers' compensation insurance. This is a big deal for Democrats. It's a big deal for the insurance industry, and it's something that folks are really working on. We've also got crop insurance, financial insurance for some of these financial products that folks want to use if banking is opened up. Well, these are all a lot of these products are insured in some manner, and if they're related to cannabis, the insurance companies and the insurance trades want to make sure that their members aren't going to get dinged by federal regulators or by the Department of Justice. To address that, there was a bill called the CLAIM Act introduced just last month. It's supported by all 9 national insurance trade groups, and it is designed in a way that mirrors the banking protections that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. So to the degree that the federal government can give insurance companies the confidence that they can insure folks and pay out settlements and not get dinged by the federal government or federal regulators, that's really important. The sponsors are really trying now to attach the CLAIM Act to cannabis banking reform legislation, but they're quite late to the table. They did get a small provision back in March into the underlying banking reform bill that extends protections to, quote, insurance, in addition to the other financial institutions. But it's just 2 or 3 words, and they're trying to take that 2 or 3 words and do a technical correction in the form of an additional bill, basically, that would be tacked on to banking reform legislation. I've got a question. Is there data somewhere that shows each representative in the House and Senate and their stance on cannabis? I think the Marijuana Policy Project has that. The Marijuana Policy Project has done a lot of work at the state level in passing medical marijuana, decriminalization, and full legalization. They've got a lot of great data and background information on what the states are doing. And if memory serves, I'm not certain, and we'll follow up on this, I think they have a list of sort of where members of Congress are falling on cannabis. Generally, you've got about 2/3 of Democrats that are very supportive, and you've got about 20% of Republicans that are pretty supportive. And then you start to get into the weeds on that other 1/3 of Democrats and that other 80% of Republicans. That's why, even though the House is moving on a lot of these bills and a lot of these initiatives, the sticking point is the Senate, and that's why Mitch McConnell, who's the Senate Majority Leader and controls what comes to the floor, is so important. And that's why the hemp bills can be sweeteners for some of these other pieces that are moving forward in the House. We can get Mr. McConnell to fix the hemp and CBD issues that his constituents worry about and attach those to perhaps a banking reform bill or a research bill that might be moving in the House. Moving on to banking, which is really where the action is. Banking reform legislation. this is really where the most attention is at the moment, as I mentioned earlier, because there's so much money in the cannabis industry, and only about 30% of cannabis businesses have long-term, reliable banking relationships. That means that there's an excess of about $7 billion a year in cash transactions that are related to cannabis. Opening up banking will make it much easier to conduct business, and business right now is pretty good. We talked a little earlier about the States Act. The States Act isn't really moving. What it would do is say if a transaction is legal in a jurisdiction, whether it's medical marijuana or personal use in Missouri or California, then it would be a legal transaction in the eyes of the federal government because it changes the Controlled Substances Act. That act is not many folks are working in that. Instead, what's really gained traction is the Safe Banking Act. This bill does not open up the Controlled Substances Act. What it does is it prohibits federal regulators from taking action against cannabis or ancillary businesses and financial institutions that service those businesses, and it prohibits federal regulators from rewarding financial institutions that do not bank cannabis businesses. So we need to be very clear that the Safe Banking Act does not legalize cannabis-related transactions. It simply prohibits federal regulators from interfering in the transactions of legitimate businesses. And Kevin, jump in if you have any questions or if I'm unclear on any of these points.
No, that's great. So it's already been approved by committee?
It has. It was approved let me step back. The Congress started in January, and in the middle of February, we had our first ever hearing related to cannabis. And it was a House Financial Services Committee hearing. Huge lines, packed room, packed overflow room, a lot of great discussion not about whether marijuana is good or bad, but really on the technical aspects of what the federal government can and cannot do with relation to legal cannabis transactions or financial transactions by legitimate cannabis and ancillary businesses. And that's really important. We've got a lot of bomb throwers on the Hill, and there are a lot of these hearings that are simply a conversation about whether marijuana is good or bad and what harm it does to society or does not do to society. This was a really technical conversation with smart folks in the room who want to address banking issues. That was in February. A month later, in the middle of March, we had a markup, which is basically taking the bill, adding amendments, and then having a vote on the bill in committee. And that vote was 45 to 15. It was overwhelming, bipartisan, and a really great boost to banking reform legislation. What this bill does is says, even though in California, in Missouri, in Illinois, these transactions are still illegal in the eyes of the federal government, even though these are illegal transactions, this bill bars federal regulators from taking any action that would impede that transaction. We have a question here: who determines the definition of, quote, legitimate business, end quote? That would be the states. So in Missouri now, a legitimate business, medical marijuana business is now a legitimate business because there's a regulatory regime there. In California, personal use marijuana sales would be legitimate because they're authorized under state law. So if the state has a law and a regulatory regime that allows a sale, and the businesses are licensed in that state and able to conduct these transactions, that's what a legitimate business is.
Jack,
Um,
can you touch upon the Senate committee hearing on
yeah.
banking?
So earlier this summer, we had all 50 state bankers associations, all 50 of them wrote to Senator Crapo, who's chair of the Senate Banking Committee, and they asked him not to support any legislation, but to simply hold a hearing on cannabis banking issues and the Safe Banking Act. That was in May, I believe, May or early June that they wrote. And at the end of July, Mr. Crapo did hold a hearing on this issue and on this bill. It's a huge step forward. One, Idaho is one of 3 states that has no legal cannabis, industrial hemp, CBD laws, none. And so it's not Mr. Crapo's constituents that are asking for action on this legislation. It's really the bankers, the credit unions, the financial institutions that work with his committee every day are telling him every day that he needs to address banking reform. Really big deal. And that was a solid hearing as well. Even most of the witnesses were Republican. Since they're in the majority in the Senate, they get to pick the majority of the witnesses. And the witnesses that they put forward, all but one, were very much on the technical solution side of things. So that was a really strong hearing, and it gives a little bit more momentum to the House moving banking reform legislation, because now there's a theoretical path forward in the Senate. No other Senate committee, I believe, has held any cannabis-related hearings. Now moving back to the House, as I said, in March there was a 45 to 15 committee vote, which was bipartisan. The sponsors have been whipping the vote for the past 5 months now to really get a strong vote in the House. And it looks like it's going to come to the floor sometime this fall. There are some potential amendments on the floor to the Safe Banking Act. I already talked about the insurance piece, the Claim Act that may attempt to be attached. We've also got pretty strong indications that a bill that would address the CBD and industrial hemp issues that we discussed earlier could be addressed. And then there's an additional amendment that would terminate a federal project called Operation Choke Point, which is basically Republicans in particular in Congress don't like Operation Choke Point because they believe that it's federal overreach. Would mean that perhaps a Democratic administration using Operation Choke Point and the tools of the Department of Justice to shut down businesses, shut down financial institutions that are servicing perhaps gun manufacturers. And under a Republican administration, Operation Choke Point could theoretically allow a Republican administration to shut down or take action against banks that are providing services to, for instance, Planned Parenthood. Operation Choke Point has never been used like that. It's never been wielded as a political tool. There are no examples that I've seen on executive overreach there, but the far right really doesn't like this program and really want it shut down. So there was a version of Operation Choke Point termination legislation came to the floor in, I believe, 2017, and the vote was 396 to 2. Democrats really don't care about choke point. Republicans really hate it. If there's an amendment added to this bill that would terminate Operation Choke Point, we'd get another 20 to 40 Republicans voting for this bill. These amendments are all designed to strengthen Republican support because Democrats are nearly united in support right now. I think we've got probably fewer than 5 Democrats in the House will vote to oppose the SAFE Banking Act if it comes to the floor. The problem that we're seeing on the Democratic side is civil rights organizations would prefer that criminal justice legislation move first, and this is causing consternation on the Democratic side, and that's really what slowed down action in the House. We've got another question here. The SAFE Act does not open up U.S. exchanges for listings. Will it open up institutional investments in cannabis operations? I'd say that's to be determined. I think in some instances, it will give some investors a little more confidence that they can participate. I don't know that institutional investors will clamor to invest. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think once banks are allowed to take cannabis money, as it were, that yes, I would think that'll be a significant support for institutional investment, private equity activity in the cannabis space.
So on the private equity side, what I've seen so far and what the word is on Capitol Hill is because institutional investment isn't available right now, small businesses are really turning to private equity for loans. Those are given out then at a higher interest rate. It puts these small businesses at a disadvantage to their competitors that who have the cash to open up a business and operate without those private equity loans. This is one place where I think there might be some, to Kevin's point, some change and some growth in the industry. And as I wrap up here, I want to reiterate, deschedule. Go ahead, Kevin.
No, I was just going to, sorry to interrupt, and kick me in the shins. We're not in the same room, but metaphorically, if you don't like this question, can you handicap what the future of the Safe Banking Act is? I guess it's easier to handicap in the House, but do you think, what would you handicap the odds of that ultimately being passed?
So I've been doing this work for about 20 years. I'd say it's almost certainly going to pass the House. The president would almost certainly sign this. The Senate is the holdup, and I think what this comes down to at the end of the day is there a package at the end of the year, probably not this year, but sometime next year, where Leader McConnell and Speaker Pelosi strike a deal on a number of broad issues, and this is one of those issues, and it would include some hemp and CBD protections and the banking piece. I would say right now, probably 40% to 50% probability of that. Not a lot of legislation has been passed in recent years, which is why I put that number pretty low, but there's a heck of a lot of pressure here. These banks have a lot of money and a lot of lobbying force. They're flexing. The insurance companies do as well. And this is a deal that I can see happening. And finally, before I turn it over to Kevin and Tio, I want to say that and reiterate that descheduling is really the only way to make all of these cannabis transactions legal in the eyes of the federal government. This bill helps, but it doesn't permanently solve the problem.
Well, thanks, Jack. Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Young. I'm a partner here in the Chicago office. With me also is Talani Ordetayo. We're going to be speaking about some recent developments with the Farm Bill and at the FDA, as well as touch upon some activities at the various states that are of interest, of particular interest, and getting a lot of attention lately. On the CBD side, or the Farm Bill, as Jack described earlier, it descheduled industrial hemp, which is, as Jack said, is defined as cannabis with a THC content no greater than 0.3% THC on a dry weight basis. And that includes sort of its products. However, the Farm Bill does sort of preserve the FDA's power and jurisdiction to oversee the safety of food, drugs, and medical devices and cosmetics. And so a lot of the sort of interest and inquiry has been following the FDA and what they're going to do in terms of regulating CBDs and CBD products. In the spring, they issued 3 warning letters to the sellers of CBDs, saying, in effect, and sending the message that they're cracking down on parties making false claims about treating diseases such as cancer or Alzheimer's. And I think my take of the spring activity was they were going to be particularly focused on false or misleading statements about health benefits or the ability to combat serious diseases such as cancer. Most recently, however, the FDA issued a warning letter to Curaleaf, and go to the prior, that's also part of the FDA release on the Curaleaf letter, where they warned Curaleaf concerning the unapproved sale of products with unsubstantiated claims to treat cancer, Alzheimer's, opioid withdrawal, pain, and pet anxiety. They gave Curaleaf 15 days to respond. Curaleaf has responded by saying that they've, in effect, scrubbed their marketing materials, their websites, to remove claims or the claims, health claims that of which the FDA complained, and indicated they were removing some of the products that the FDA raised concerns with. Interestingly, CVS pulled some of the Curaleaf products from their inventory. So this is a very interesting development, and so we'll be watching to see how the FDA responds to Curaleaf's responsive action. Let's go to the next slide. We included this because I think it's an illustrative list of the sorts of claims of which in which the FDA has concerns, and I think if you're sort of assessing the level of risk of selling CBD products, and in particular how you market those products, which again is where this FDA seems to be particularly focused, this would be an instructive list in terms of what the FDA is looking at. Again, these 2 slides are all taken from the FDA release of its action against Curaleaf. The sort of looking at the list, it certainly echoes the concerns that were raised in April about the claims about the ability to fight cancer, Alzheimer's disease. Interestingly, this also covers claims that it treats depression and anxiety, chronic pain, ADHD, and also the use in dog products. I've seen also other discussion. The FDA seems to be particularly uncomfortable with sale of dog food with CBD. As I said, the Curaleaf has responded. I have not seen any FDA action in response to what Curaleaf has done. Again, we'll be monitoring that. Theo, did you have something? So let's go to move on to the state developments, and I'll let Theo speak to that.
Hey, I'm T.O. Odutayo. I am an associate here in the Chicago office. So Illinois passed the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, which makes recreational cannabis legal for adults 21 years and older, beginning January 1st of next year. The act provides for 7 types of licenses, 2 cultivation center licenses, 2 dispensing licenses, a new craft grower license, an infuser license, and a transporter license. The 2 early approval licenses, one for cultivation centers and the other for dispensaries, are only available for existing medical cannabis license holders. The number of each of these license types will be limited to the number of dispensaries and cultivation centers currently operating under the state's medical program. Central to the Act is its social equity component, which aims to reduce barriers to ownership of cannabis businesses for those individuals and communities most affected by the war on drugs. First, social equity applicants get 50% of all application fees waived. The state has also set up a Cannabis Business Development Fund, which will provide low interest rate loans and grants to qualified social equity applicants. The fund will start with about $12 million and go up from there. Applications for dispensaries are scored out of 250 points. 50 of those points, or 20% of all available points, will be awarded to applicants who qualify as social equity applicants. This includes applicants that fall into one of the following 3 categories. Applicants for which 51% of the company is owned by individuals that live in a disproportionately impacted area for 5 of the last 10 years. Applicants for which 51% of the company is owned by individuals or individuals with immediate family members who have been arrested or convicted of an offense eligible for expungement under the Act, or applicants for which 51% of the full-time employees fit the previously mentioned requirements. Note that the Illinois Department of Agriculture is yet to release the scoring system for cultivation center license.
And as I referred to earlier, the social equity component was very interesting, and it has been the focus of a lot of other states, and as to how Illinois advanced the social equity and how other states might adopt or change their law to promote social equity.
Hey, T.O. and Kevin, it's Gail. You may have mentioned it, but I do think it's important to also mention that the Act provides for bonus points in addition to the low interest rate loans for social equity applicants. You may have mentioned it, T.O., and maybe I just didn't hear it, but I just want to make sure I wanted to get that out there as well.
No, that's good. I'm glad you mentioned that.
And that's and the bonus points appear to be 20% of the available points. So, as you know, as we just wrapped up here in Missouri, each point counts. So, you know, that's a large number of that's a large percentage of available points. So, people that are considered social equity applicants should definitely take a look at the adult use side in Illinois.
Yep. So, on the medical front, earlier this month, Illinois amended and made permanent its medical cannabis pilot program. As a part of the amendment, both advanced practice registered nurses and physician assistants are now able to certify patients under the state's medical program. Additionally, the amended law provides that for dispensing organizations registered on or after July 1st of this year, the prohibition against being located within residential buildings or areas zoned for residential use, along with the prohibition against being located within 1,000 feet of pre-existing schools, does not apply to those dispensing organizations registered on or after July 1st. So it still applies to the medical facilities who were early adopters and were registered prior to July 1st of this year. Last, the amendment incorporates the social equity component, which was essentially borrowed from the state's recreational bill, which we just discussed. So here's a list of the new qualifying conditions. There's 11 in total. Of note, I think, is the chronic pain condition, which is a qualifying condition in many other states. It was not originally included in Illinois's medical program, which at its inception was one of the strictest medical cannabis programs in the country. So some updates on some state-specific updates we have on California first. So California remains, to no surprise, the largest and most mature cannabis market in the country. After a $500 million drop in sales in 2018, the state has rebounded and projects to hit 3.1, I'm sorry, that was $500 million drop in 2018 and expects to hit 3.1 billion in sales for 2019. It's expected that by 2024, the state of California will record about $7.2 billion in sales, which would make the state's market 40% larger than the entire country of Canada. In 2016, Californians legalized recreational use of cannabis via Proposition 64. We're still kind of seeing the rollout of Proposition 64 today. One issue that the state is dealing with in regards to Prop 64 is that each city or county may choose whether or not to allow recreational cannabis businesses in their locale. This creates difficulties for multi-location operators as the requirements may vary from one location to the other. According to one report, as much as 76% of all municipalities in the state of California do not allow retail cannabis businesses despite Proposition 64. However, a bill was introduced in the state legislature, AB 1356, which seeks to remedy this. Though the bill has stalled, its goal was to require municipalities for which the majority of its residents voted in favor of Prop 64 to issue a certain amount of retail licenses. Municipalities will have to approve either one dispensary license for every 4 liquor stores or one dispensary license for every 10,000 residents, whichever is smaller. For a city like Sacramento, that could mean issuing up to 100 dispensary licenses, as there are a little over 400 liquor stores in the city. In Los Angeles, the largest cannabis market within the state, round 1 of Phase 3 dispensary licensing is underway. The city's Department of Cannabis Regulation recently announced that out of 1,800 applicants for the 100 Type 10 retail licenses, 800 were qualified social equity applicants, which proportionally is a huge number. With regard to banking, the Department of Finance published an analysis which kind of frustrates the effort to relax banking laws for cannabis businesses in California. The analysis highlights the severe risks of legislation establishing a banking system for cannabis businesses, and the department expressed concern that legislation would bring the state in conflict with federal laws intended to prevent money laundering. In Missouri, in November of last year, Missourians approved a ballot measure which resulted in a constitutional amendment making medical cannabis legal in the state. That's Amendment 2. Qualifying conditions under the program included cancer, epilepsy, glaucoma, HIV, as well as several other enumerated chronic conditions. So far, the state has approved applications for a little over 4,500 medical patients, and that's just in the first month. The goal of the drafters was to craft a program which would result in medical cannabis access to 2 to 2.5% of the state's residents by year 3 of the program. The program contemplates 60 licenses for cultivation centers in Missouri, 192 licenses for dispensaries, 86 licenses for processing sites, and 10 licenses for testing labs. As of last week, the state had received more than 1,200 applicants for these 348 licenses.
Actually, Tio, let me clarify that. We ended up so last Monday was the date that the applications were due, and we found out on Wednesday-ish of last week that there were over 2,100 applications that were successfully filed. Of what percentage will get kicked out, we have no idea. But it went from they had 800 applicants file on Monday alone. So that number is a huge number, way higher than we had anticipated in Missouri.
Yeah, that is a huge number. And just one last quick note: there are some spectators wondering how the Illinois recreational use program is going to affect its border state, Missouri. The Missouri State Highway Patrol has expressed some concern about legalization and what it would mean for the state. However, there's lower cannabis taxes in Missouri and, federal drug laws which probably will work to minimize any sort of effect that Illinois legalization has on Missouri.
Tio, let me just jump in. You mentioned the local municipal zoning issues in California, and just want to share that we're seeing that is a big issue in Illinois as well. While the recreational cannabis bill or adult use bill legalized adult use of cannabis and provides a path for existing dispensaries to be able to sell recreational cannabis, it defers to the municipalities as to whether they're going to allow the sale of recreational or adult use cannabis. And several of the Chicago suburbs have indicated they're disinclined to allow that. So that's going to be a very interesting development as to what extent the municipalities are going to block sale of adult use cannabis.
Kevin, here in Missouri, we've had that same issue, obviously, on the medicinal side as well. Even as of the time in which the applications were due and received, there were various municipalities here in Missouri that had not even regulated vis-a-vis, a zoning ordinance or whatnot to set forth, whether or not they would allow for the any less than the statutorily required 1,000 feet from a school, church, or daycare. So we did have some communities come out early on and lessen those standards, but even today we still sit here with a lot of municipalities that have not addressed it yet.
Hey, Gail, I don't know if you see the questions. We've just got a question as to whether we know where the locations, or I would ask the concentration of the applications are in Missouri, or if that information is going to be released at some point.
We're told by DHSS, who is regulating the medical cannabis here in Missouri, we're told that because of the overwhelming number of applicants, their number one priority right now is to get through the applications, but that they do intend to release a district-by-district sort of facility-by-facility map in the next coming weeks.
Thank you.
Just a quick recap of a federal overview. As Jack mentioned earlier, cannabis is a $11 billion a year industry. Counting Illinois, there are now 11 states plus Washington, D.C. which allow recreational cannabis use, and there are 33 states plus DC which have a medical cannabis program. Jack also mentioned the chairman of National Credit Union Administration stated that credit unions won't be punished simply for working with cannabis businesses, provided that they follow existing federal guidance to ensure customers aren't violating anti-money laundering laws, which, if you remember, is a similar focus of the California state regulators. In New York, the state decriminalized possession of up to 57 grams of cannabis, which now will be subject to a $500 fine. New York was an early adopter of decriminalization, decriminalizing up to 25 grams of cannabis back in the 70s. Although they decriminalized, New York attempted to legalize cannabis through the proposed Marijuana Regulation and Tax Act. And while there was great momentum early on, ultimately there was not enough support to pass the bill this session. Some sticking points included who would control the tax revenues and tax allocation, as well as the expected participation of social equity and minority applicants in the program. There is some hope that the bill will be reintroduced in New York or a similar bill proposed in the next legislative session, as Governor Cuomo remains committed to legalizing recreational cannabis, but the likelihood may be low given how little usually happens during an election year. And also, New York has no process for a citizen ballot initiative to put on the ballot for 2020. Similar to New York, New Jersey attempted to legalize recreational cannabis earlier this year. The legislature was unable to come to an agreement with tax rates, also a big area of discord. And New Jersey may make an attempt to legalize either through legislature or a ballot initiative. But although ballot initiatives are permitted in New Jersey, unlike New York, a ballot initiative in New Jersey would need to be put forth by the legislature as a constitutional amendment rather than as a new law. Last, in Colorado, potential patients will now qualify for the medical program if they suffer from any condition for which opioids could be prescribed, which is similar to what Illinois enacted, I believe, earlier this year.
Okay. Kevin, did you or Jack have anything else to add?
I would just share, Jack, I mean, there's a lot of energy at the federal level, and a couple things worth noting is the ABA is it a letter, Jack, that the ABA has issued urging Congress to act?
Yeah, the Bar Association did that a few weeks ago. Big deal.
Yeah.
And the other ABA, the American Bankers Association, is also heavily engaged on these issues. But as with anything, the more folks that are weighing in with Congress, the more companies that are advocating a fix, the more people that have a voice in D.C., the more chance we're going to have of passing legislation that can really make a difference in business operations.
Right. The state's attorneys general have been sending letters to the feds as well, encouraging, in particular, banking reform.
Yep. We had about a bipartisan letter from 38 attorney generals, state attorney generals earlier this summer. We also had the state treasurers weigh in with a bipartisan letter, and you've got individual governors that are writing to their members of Congress and to committee chairs asking, again, the momentum is really around banking. The big guys are all weighing in, and we need small folks to weigh in as well and make sure that it isn't just the big institutional banks that are being protected, but it's the mom and pop stores that can get loans, and that we're looking at this from a variety of perspectives. That's what's really going to carry the day at this.
To clarify one earlier point, the 20% or 50 points awarded for Illinois' dispensary applications for social equity applicants won't necessarily act as bonus points. They're included in the 250 points total, which can be awarded to any applicant. But the state does offer 5 additional bonus points, which aren't included in the 250 total, for applicants who develop a community engagement plan.
Gail, I think that covers.
That's about it. Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank Jack, Kevin, and T.O. for participating, and I want to thank you all for participating in our webinar today. Please take a minute to complete and submit the survey located in the widget at the bottom of your screen. Thank you.
Thank you.